Greetings, folks. So my name is Patrick Walsh, and I'm a professor of economics at St. Michael's College. And today we're going to be talking just a little bit about something that a lot of people have been having a lot of questions about, which is how does the COVID pandemic affect the economy? And in particular, how does it affect the U.S. economy? So one of the first things that I want to talk about just briefly is this idea where how the current economic downturn that's resulting from the COVID pandemic might be a little bit different from the typical type of recession. So typically when we have a recession, it's because some of a big sector of the spenders in the economy, typically we think sort of consumers, but also businesses, spending to invest in new capital, that those spenders spend less, that they're trying to build up savings rather than trying to consume, and so they pull back. They're not willing to take risks, and that results in a reduction in what economists would call aggregate demand. Okay, and that is happening here for the COVID pandemic. Another aspect of it, of the current situation, that's a little unusual relative to kind of the more typical recession, is that the supply side of the economy, the producers, right, who are making and selling products and services, are also forced to pull back. A lot of them are forced to shut down. So not only do we have a hit on the spending side that consumers and businesses don't really want to spend a lot of money. It's also they even if they wanted to, they sort of couldn't, right? Because a lot of that production capacity is being shut down. So that's a little bit of a difference, of a nuance of what's going on now. Okay, so in terms of the effects of the pandemic on the economy, I'll talk about the effects on output and then also the effects on employment. So here we have, this is the growth rate of GDPs, or gross domestic product, which is economists' fancy word for talking about sort of the production, the output in the economy, which also for reasons is the same thing as the income earned by all the people in the economy. And so the latest data that we have, and sort of the first data point that we have that reflects the effects of the pandemic, is the change in GDP in the first quarter of 2020. And that shows that GDP actually fell by about 4.8% in that first quarter. Okay. And that's obviously because of those two effects we just talked about, of not only consumers pulling back and not buying as much, but also producers not being able to produce, right? Not being able to bring in workers. So all of that together results in this big drop in production, in output, and in income. So looking forward, a lot of people are very curious. Well, what does the future path of this look like? And here you'll hear people sort of talking about different letters, like what's the shape of the recovery. So this graph here shows the trend in the level of GDP. Right. So if this was the kind of the growth rate, this is the speedometer. Right. This is showing the level of where we're actually at or have been over time, and so people are saying, okay, well, what's the recovery going to look like? One scenario would be that output drops pretty sharply, but then as we sort of get a handle on the pandemic and really get it clamped down, the economy can open back up again and can actually have a pretty strong, pretty rapid recovery. So people call that the V-shape sort of recession and recovery, so sort of sharp down, but then a nice sharp recovery. Another possibility would be something that you might call more of a U-shape, that the decline is slower, but maybe it takes a lot longer to reach the bottom. Okay, so it's declining for longer, and then recovers much more slowly. And we'll talk about what sort of different scenarios on the epidemiological part, right? So the biological part of the pandemic sort of correlates with these different possibilities. And then maybe the worst of all worlds might be this L-shaped recovery, where output falls and then just sort of stays flat. And, it has this very, very slow recovery, if at all. So that's an outcome we would like to avoid. Okay. So what are economists sort of projecting? What are they forecasting, right? And so here we're talking. This is mostly private sector economists at large banks or consulting groups, right? That produce these forecasts, as a data product, as their business. So what we think we're looking at here is roughly an 8 to 12% drop in GDP as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, and that's from the peak, the most recent peak. So basically, fourth quarter of 2019, right, is the most recent peak. We think that output and income, or GDP, will bottom out about 8 to 12% below that. Okay, and then ideally recover. Reasonable question is, well, how long is it going to take before GDP gets back to where it was before the pandemic hit? Again, these forecasts are subject to a wide range of uncertainty, and this particular graph may suggest more precision than we can actually achieve. But sort of a common guess among these macroeconomic forecasters is by the end of next year, maybe, right? So by the fourth quarter of 2021, output and income might get kind of back to where it was before the pandemic. Okay, so we're looking at a pretty significant drop in economic activity, and it's not something that is going to snap right back. It's going to take a while to get back to where we were. To provide just a little bit of a sort of context for that, I want to compare this to an experience that a lot of people may be familiar with, which was the recession following the 2008 financial crisis. Okay, and in that case, we've been through this, right? We've been through, we can look back with the data and see what happened. GDP from the peak to the trough, where output bottomed out, back in 2008, 2009, that drop was about 4% of GDP. It was about a 4% decline. And that was a very significant hit to economic activity, hit to incomes, hit to employment. We remember that. Remember how bad that was. Well, we're looking at a decrease in GDP because of coronavirus that's roughly twice that. Okay, so however bad the 2008 recession, people call it the Great Recession, however bad that was, we're looking at something that is at least twice as severe in terms of the drop in economic output. Okay. So let's turn now to look at the effects on employment or unemployment. So this is the unemployment rate in the United States going back to the early 80s. And you can see a spike for this early 80s recession. You can see a big spike in sort of 2008, 2009, 2010 for that Great Recession that we just talked about. Those vertical bands, those gray bands, indicate recessions. So anyway, how does the current situation compare to those past spikes in unemployment? And it's almost hard to see. You look at what's going on with the pixels on the way far end of the graph. No, that's what's happening. Okay, so unemployment in February was about 3.5%. Unemployment in April was up to 14.7%. Okay, so 3.5% unemployment to 14.7% unemployment in the space of 2 months. That is a virtually unprecedented spike up in unemployment. And as you can see from the graph, this increase in unemployment is much more severe than it was back in 2008. Okay, again, evidence that this hit to output and employment is going to be far worse than it was in 2008. It's bigger than the early 80s recession, which was sort of the big deal prior to that. So you have people saying you really have to go back to the Great Depression to see a jump in unemployment that's this strong. Okay, so going forward, what's where are we going to go from here? It's not crazy to expect we had a sharp increase in unemployment. It's not crazy to expect that we might ideally have a sharp decrease in unemployment. That there might be a period where the unemployment rate comes back down pretty rapidly, as the economy opens up, as people go back to spending, and businesses open back up and get back to producing and bringing their workers back. So it hopefully will have the sharp spike up and then a pretty sharp spike back down. But still, it's not going to come back to where it was anytime soon. So remember, 3.5% unemployment that we had even beginning of this year. It's extremely low, and it's really even if a lot of that unemployment is soaked back up later this year, it's going to take a while. It's going to take more than a year, maybe several years, to get back to that very low level of unemployment. So in this graph, they have this phase of like sharply dropping unemployment and then sort of more chipping away at it. And it's not clear at this point, are we going to have more the sharp drop part or more of the gradual chipping away? It's pretty hard to forecast at this point. Okay, so I don't know about you. I could use just a little bit of good news at this point. Comparing the coronavirus pandemic to the 1918 flu epidemic, one of the really tough things about the 1918 pandemic was that, again, kind of going to the biology, to the epidemiology of it, the people who were most directly affected and who had the highest fatality rate was young, otherwise healthy people in sort of their prime working years. So people in their 20s and 30s who were some of the biggest contributors to the labor force. They were the ones, right, who were most at risk of dying in the 1918 pandemic. So what that did in 1918 was basically sort of give two punches, two hits to the economy. First of all, as we're seeing now, the economy really had to shut down, and output and employment fell dramatically, because of the quarantines. So that was one hit, but then also you're literally losing large chunks of your most productive workforce. So even after the pandemic has passed and we're opening back up again, you've lost a slice of your labor force, and that kind of puts an upper limit on how quickly and how strongly the economy can recover. So the good news, right, this time around is that appears not to be the case, right? That as we're pretty aware, the people most at risk from the current pandemic are seniors, or people over age 50 or so. And trust me, I'm not saying this is like, oh, it's great that they're the ones who are at risk. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is, since the risk and the death rates for people in their prime working years is really quite low, we're going to get one punch, economically speaking, from this disease. But we're not going to get that second punch of, we've permanently removed some part of your productive labor force. That vast majority of people at working age in the United States will come back, will be able to come back and work once the economy starts recovering. Okay. So talking just a little bit more about that recovery, what's it going to look like? And here, economists are pretty clear of saying that you're not going to fix the economy until you fix the pandemic. Okay, that some people use the phrase, the virus is in charge. So we're not really going to have a permanent fix for the economy. The economy really can't get back to normal until we've really got the pandemic itself locked down. So what that means is, the nature of the economic recovery depends very much on what the pandemic looks like. So, for example, if it turns out that the big spike in coronavirus cases that we had in February, March, April in the United States, if that really is the big spike, and after that, bumps around, but it's at a very manageable level, we've got testing and tracing, we're able to keep it locked down, well, then that actually means, it's very likely that we'll have this, sharp V-shaped recovery, right? It was one hit, got it over with, and now we can look at recovery. On the other hand, if we have double spikes, right, and this graph down here, the first spike is what we had in February, March, April. Possible we could have another spike, maybe even a worse spike in coronavirus cases in the fall, right? Well, that's going to be really difficult for the economy because it sort of adds to this uncertainty. It sort of adds to both for consumers and then also for businesses, right? So consumers is like do I want to buy a new house? Do I want to shell out for a new car or a new refrigerator or something when all this could blow up again and I could lose my job? And businesses same way. It's just like, do I want to hire up a whole bunch of workers if 3 months from now I'm gonna have to shut it all back down again, right? So if we're looking at a scenario where we get this spike last winter and then another spike in the fall, and then that's going to be very, very difficult for the economy, and that's going to push us more into this kind of stop-start, very halting, very slow recovery. So really, at this point, the best thing we can do for the economy is to get a handle on the medical side of it, right? To get a handle on the epidemiological side. Okay, all of these impacts are not necessarily equal across the country. So we can look at the trends in GDP, and GDP fell, and unemployment goes up, but those are not sort of evenly spread out across the economy. So one way to think about this is across different businesses, different sectors, and as a lot of us I think are familiar, a lot of travel industry, hotels, hospitality, restaurants and bars, these sort of retail, in-person retail type things, right? So those where you kind of need the consumer to be in a particular place, those are obviously just getting absolutely hammered under these quarantines, right? So even services like haircuts, right? And this is why my hair looks like this. Is those types of establishments, those type of businesses are absolutely getting absolutely clobbered. The people who work in those are absolutely getting clobbered. But that's not the entire economy, right? There are other sectors where the workers and the businesses maybe have had to change how they do what they do, but they're keeping the wheels running. They're continuing to work and produce and earn money. So a lot of professional services, whether it's finance or creative stuff or IT or these different sectors where it's basically moving electrons around. Well, you can do that from home, okay? And a lot of people are, so they're staying employed. They're still producing. They're still earning money. So that can provide a little bit of buoyancy to the economy. Also, things like utilities, right? We still need electricity, right? So the utility workers are finding ways to keep producing those necessary services, with masks and gloves or however they do it. And then also it's worth pointing out that there are sectors of the economy that are in high demand. Okay, so obviously healthcare, right? There's tons of resources pouring into healthcare because that's what we need right now. And likewise, scientific research, right? We need some scientific research to develop a vaccine for this as quickly as possible. So there are sectors that are absolutely getting crushed. Other sectors that are keeping it going, right? Maybe in a slightly different way, and then other sectors that actually are sort of booming. The overall picture is a decline, but there's a lot of variation between that. And then also another way that the economic impacts of coronavirus is not uniform, it's not equally spread, is geographically. So this shows cases per 100,000 people. So the dark areas, it's not just the nose count of cases, it's the density of cases, right? So what's the rate of cases? And long story short, what you're going to see is those regions of the country that are hit more severely with the coronavirus, they're going to have a stronger economic hit. Okay, their economies, they're going to have to shut down, more intensively and for longer, and that's just going to have a bigger economic hit than those sort of more pale areas where they don't really have a lot of coronavirus cases per capita. They can probably keep the economy ticking over more strongly than the more affected cases. So anyway, we can look at these overall trends in GDP and employment, but there's actually a lot of variation among industries and across geographic areas. Okay, so finally, let's talk about what to do about all this, right? Or what is being done. And usually when economists talk about sort of policy responses, at least in macroeconomics, we're really talking about two different angles or two different tools. One is monetary policy, and the other is fiscal policy. So we'll talk about each one of those. So monetary policy, remember, if you've taken an economics class, right, maybe at St. Mike's, that's conducted by the Federal Reserve, okay, and they affect the macroeconomy by basically increasing or decreasing the money supply, so dialing up or down the rate of growth of basically the number of dollars. Okay, so how has the Federal Reserve responded to this big drop in output because of coronavirus? First, they've cut interest rates to zero, so that's typically the kind of traditional monetary policy move, right, is for the Federal Reserve to change the interest rate. So they've done that, okay, cut it down to zero, right? So they've sort of, in terms of the traditional monetary policy tools, pretty much maxed that out. The Federal Reserve has also engaged in basically unlimited asset purchases. So they're buying up treasury bonds or buying up other financial assets from the financial markets, and they are not committing themselves to any limit on that. They're not saying, well, we're going to stop doing it on this date, or we're only going to buy X amount. There's just like, we're going to keep purchasing these assets until the economy gets back to where we want it to be. Okay, so that's called quantitative easing. So that's a phrase you may be familiar with. First saw it from the Federal Reserve in response to the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Okay, the Federal Reserve is also making loans available anyway, to big Wall Street banks, right? Which doesn't make anyone really happy, right? It's sort of this idea of like, oh, they get their bailouts. What? The idea here, right, is that those large Wall Street banks, they themselves make loans to all of the local banks, right, that you and I on Main Street go to get mortgages, buy a car, businesses go to borrow from them. Okay, so nobody likes shoveling more money to these large Wall Street banks, but it does have the effect of keeping sort of those local banks afloat. But it doesn't have to be either or. The Federal Reserve is also making loans available to Main Street businesses, right? So, and again, the idea is, it's not cramming that money down their throat, but it's saying, look, right, if you're this business, you've got people employed, you've seen this huge drop in demand, right, or you've had to shut down because of the quarantine, and you can't get loans, right, from any other source, come to the Federal Reserve, and we will sort of bridge you over to the time when the economy might be recovering. Okay, and then also the Federal Reserve has been making loans available to state and local governments, right? So they've seen a huge crash in their tax revenues, right? So think of sales tax that completely evaporated, right? And without some help, they would have to lay off a lot of state and local workers, which really we're talking about cops, teachers, firefighters, okay, road crews. So so the Federal Reserve is also making loans to those organizations. Okay, and then finally, fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, remember, so that is changes in spending. Okay, so federal government spending and taxes intended to affect the economy. And that's not the Federal Reserve's responsibility. That's basically Congress passing legislation, changing taxes and spending, and being signed by the president. Okay. And there's also been quite a bit of activity there. Congress has passed and President has signed about $2.5 trillion in new spending from the federal government. And for context, that's about 12% of GDP. So that's a pretty robust response, robust sort of stimulus to the economy. That includes checks to individuals. We heard about the $1,200 that most taxpayers were going to get. Payroll support for businesses, right? So this is ideally, anyway. The concept is instead of just shoveling money out to businesses, it's kind of strings attached. We don't want those businesses to just take all that money and then turn around and lay off all their workers. It's no, use this money. You have to use this money to keep your workers on the payroll, even if you're shut down, even if you're not producing anything. One of the lessons that we found is that it's actually much easier to preserve a job than it is to create a new job. Right? That was one of the big lessons coming out of the 2008 financial crisis. That it takes a long time, takes a lot of effort, and takes a lot of money, truthfully, to take an unemployed worker and make them employed. It's a lot easier to keep, a current sort of match between a worker and an employer. It's a lot easier to preserve that than to try to fix a broken one. Okay, and then obviously increased healthcare funding, kind of a no-brainer in the middle of a pandemic. Another aspect of fiscal policy that I think a lot of people overlook is what macroeconomists would call sort of these existing automatic stabilizers. And that's, programs that have been in place, a lot of them for decades, that, they've already existed, and, they sort of kick into effect when people's incomes drop or when people lose jobs. So, the most obvious example would be the unemployment insurance, which actually has got a boost to its funding on a per-person basis. As part of some of these packages. But I mean, that program's been around for decades, right? And if you lose your job, you apply for unemployment insurance, right? And it doesn't replace all of your salary, but for a period, usually I think it's about 26 weeks, about half the year, you do get unemployment checks that can kind of help, cover for rent or groceries or keep you afloat until you get a new job. So that program's there, and as we get this flood of people losing their jobs, they're going to be able to rely on unemployment insurance, right? This sort of automatic program that's keeping their purchasing power from completely disappearing. Okay, and then also you get these typical, anti-poverty programs. Whether it's SNAP providing food or Medicaid, right? So if your incomes drop, you qualify for Medicaid. So these are programs that, as people's incomes fall, they become eligible for these programs. And that sort of provides, why are we talking about this in the context of the macroeconomy? Well, it provides more purchasing power, okay? Or it prevents purchasing power from dropping as dramatically as it would have. And that's why we call it the automatic stabilizers. There's actually a fair number of economists who would actually like to see more stimulus spending, right? So, remember, we think the drop in GDP is going to be at least twice as bad as it was in 2008, 2009. Remember, that was no picnic. So there's some economists who say, we could do more. Okay, and in particular, some economists would like to see more aid to state and local governments. Right, again, especially the sales tax revenue is absolutely destroyed. And rather than having them, having to lay off, teachers and police officers and firefighters, and kind of contributing to the decline in employment and income, let's have the federal government, right, send more aid to those state and local governments and keep those jobs in place. Also, infrastructure spending. It's not like we don't need infrastructure fixes, right? So we have bridges falling down, stuff like that, because they're too old. So economists say, this is a win-win. This is a no-brainer. Spend money, create jobs, create these construction jobs, decently well-paying jobs, and we'll come out of it with this nice, fresh, sparkling new infrastructure, and instead of the 50, 60, 70-year-old rusting infrastructure that we have now. Okay, so those are some of the responses. I'm going to end it there. There's more that we can talk about, but I hope this kind of gives you sort of a little overview of how economists think about what's happened, how to respond to it, and where we might be